When my wife and I started looking for our first house, our main goal was to not have a mortgage payment. We ended up finding this house here being offered at $19,000. I negotiated the price to $11,000 and we made the purchase. We ended up spending about $20,000 to $25,000 over a course of a year in doing the renovation. It also created a lot of reclaimed wood, which I used in making furniture that I sell to customers. In this video, I'll show you how I built a kitchen island using some of the wood from the ceiling joists in the kitchen. Let's get started. Along with this video, I'm offering a set of woodworking plans that can be used to build this exact kitchen island. It's a combination of measured drawings and text to help you get it built. There's a link in the description that goes to my website, homesteadcraftsman.com, if you'd like to see more. The majority of the lumber used in building the base for the kitchen island is new and purchased from Lowe's. You could also pick it up from any other similar type store. The legs are made from Douglas fir 4x4s and the aprons and rails are made from 2x6s. I start the process by cutting my 4x4s to length and then turning the legs to their profiles. If you want to follow along and build one of these yourself and don't have a lathe, that's not a problem. There's a lot of other designs that you can do that would not require to actually turn the leg. You could have just a square leg, a tapered leg, a carved leg, whatever you need to do. All you're going to need is a nice square area up where your mortise and tenon is at the apron and then down below at the rails. Other than that, it really doesn't matter. Structurally speaking, pretty much anything is going to work. I'm just using an old vintage Delta Rockwell lathe and a bunch of old tools. Pretty much you're going to see that I'm doing things very simply. I use a skew chisel to do most of my work, and I use it in a wide variety of techniques. A lot of times I'm just simply using it like a scraper. I also use roughing gouges, smaller skew chisels, round nose scrapers like you see there, but usually the final finish is smoothing things down for the most part with a skew chisel. I find it to be very versatile. So that first leg that I turned that you saw me comparing, the one up on the rack there, that is sort of my prototype, and then I turn the other three legs to match that one. So I usually start out with a rough idea of what I'm going to do and then turn that one out and then turn the remaining to match that. That way you're not working from a drawing each time. You're going to work from the actual leg. So if that first leg's a little different, you turn to match everything else to that. When I choose not to use my fest tool Domino to cut all my joinery, I use a hollow chisel mortiser with a 3/4 inch bit. It's basically a drill press with a hollow chisel and a drill bit in the middle, and I'm cutting 3/4 inch by whatever length I need. Once I get all those done, I move on to my aprons. Again, these are 2x6s, so it's spruce, and I usually just skim them through the planer to get them all to a consistent thickness. I cut my tenons using a radial arm saw, and if you have a varying thickness in board, that will throw off the thickness of your mortises. So having them all be a consistent thickness is pretty important when you're using a radial arm saw. If you go a different route, such as using some sort of table saw jig like I've done in past videos, the thickness of your boards can be anything, because in the end the tenon is spaced off the fence and not based off the thickness of the board itself. In my videos, you're going to see me using a lot of tools that you may not have, but don't let that get you down. Pretty much anything that you see me do can be done with hand tools alone if you need to go that far. But you know, I mean, you can acquire a lot of very inexpensive tools off of Craigslist, from friends, borrowing things, and just in general, you can adapt your specific tools you have to the project, or more, adapt the project to the tools you have. So like for example, I ripped my apron boards down a little bit from the 5.5 inches that a 2x6 is. I ripped that down to 5 inches. I like to get that new fresh edge and make sure they're all consistent width, but it's really not that important in the end. Having an extra 1/2 inch to avoid having to have a table saw to actually rip those boards down, it's no big deal. And so pretty much if you have a good assortment of hand tools and just maybe a few power tools, you can achieve anything you see me do in my videos. I started out learning to do all of my woodworking with only hand tools, and then used power tools to do those same techniques. And what you're seeing me use, my tools, they're not the best tools that one can have. Everything is a progression, starting out with your basic hand tools and then buying more advanced tools as you need them. You'll notice me in my videos, I use my Doweled MBF. This is a 9.5-inch radial arm saw to do quite a bit of work. I like it more than using my chop saw. It's much quieter, it's much more pleasant, it's an interesting tool to use. For doing a lot of ripping, I like to use my bandsaw instead of my table saw, because my table saw is normally piled up with a lot of stuff, and I find a bandsaw to be much safer. I use my radial arm saw to do cutting the tenons when I'm not, again, using my best tool, Domino, and then I use my bandsaw to trim them down to size. And a lot of times you'll notice after I cut my joinery, I go and I use my hand plane like you see here. I'm using a little shoulder hand plane to get them down to their final dimension. If your boards are not the exact same thickness when you cut them with a radial arm saw, the thickness of the tenons will be a little variation between one tenon to the next. So making sure you've got them to a consistent thickness, your apron boards first, is important. That's cutting a little bevel on the leading edge of that tenon to make sure that it doesn't scrape the glue off as it slides into the joint. So yeah, the most of these projects, it's the same techniques done multiple times. So I already did my apron boards, and now I'm going to work on my shelving boards. So while things like the dimensions of your tenons and the shape of the end part may vary, it really is all the same technique. Sometimes people get overwhelmed looking at a set of plans or thinking about building a project, but anything that's complicated is normally just a series of a lot of simple steps. It's just once it involves a lot of steps, it seems complicated, but in reality, it's not. This is an example of not being overly picky about what every radius is in a set of plans that you may be reading, or worrying about making sure that, like in that case, that little round area is a very specific, like I said, radius or diameter. Just picking up various things in your shop and basing things off that. Most of the time I'm tracing either my wood filler can, quart cans, or gallon cans to get curves. If I need something really big, you can just kind of make a tool basically just with a nail and one piece of end of the wood and then a series of holes where your pencil goes, and you can draw any kind of radius you want when you need to get into bigger stuff. One thing you're going to kind of run into on occasion is projects like this, and ones that are more advanced sometimes can have quite a bit of joinery. And when you get a lot of joinery, it can get a little complicated when it comes to the actual glue up. So I advise before you just bust out the glue and start smearing it everywhere that you kind of assemble your piece, if possible. Sometimes it's not, but assemble your piece dry and kind of see what it's going to be like to actually glue the piece up. That gets you a plan together, and that gave you a disaster. And I've had those disasters before where you get to gluing something up and you realize you don't have the right clamps or the right setup, and you can have glue setting on you, and it can really get bad. In this case, I just went straight to the glue up because I make stuff like this all the time and it's not that complicated. Another thing you're going to notice in this project is that there are going to be some rails that get added between those lower rails that support the shelf. those are going to get added in later. In my set of plans, I put the dimensions for those rails, but if your legs are slightly out of square, for example, that dimension could change a little bit by, you know, 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch or so. So I like to wait till I'm done, measure that distance, and then cut the rails to a specific size. But if everything's dead square, you know, you can usually just stick with a set of plans, but it doesn't always work out that way. For installing these rails, what I like to do to hold them in place while I'm doing the step that's after this one is I drill some pocket hole screws and then attach them in place. Then I'm going to come in afterwards. This will be after the paint job, you'll see later, and I'm going to drill in and then put dowels in there to kind of handle the weight of that shelf. In the end, it's not a big shelf. It's not holding a lot of weight. If you didn't want to use dowels, you could use just screws. You could just countersink some holes and drill and then plug those holes. For painting, you can pretty much do anything you want. I usually use brushes and rollers, and then sometimes I will spray. When I spray, I'm just using, or any kind of paint job I'm doing on my farm style furniture, I just use black or white latex wall paint. So I get the cheapest flat paint that I can get from Lowe's. It gets a distress finish in the end anyway. So the paint itself does not matter as much. And I've made many, many pieces of furniture over the years, and I've never had a single issue with any of the paint jobs. So I like to thin down my finishes before I spray them through this type of a gun. That's more of a gun that you would spray clear finishes or finishes designed to be sprayed, whereas a latex paint is extremely thick. Next up is making the small shelf to go onto the island, and how I got these 3/4 inch boards is pretty funny. I was driving down the road and saw a construction dumpster with a lot of nice looking lumber sticking out of it. I pulled over, asked if I could have the lumber, and while I was collecting it all up out of the dumpster, a group of maybe 5 or 6 guys along with a fellow who owned the building were trying to remove a roof that went across an entire building about 50 feet long. They were having a lot of trouble, and it was looking pretty dangerous the way they were going about it. They were basically standing under the roof trying to pry it off the building. So their goal was to get it to collapse, and they're standing under it. I asked them if it was okay if I helped them because I thought everybody was going to die, and they said sure. I climbed up on top of this building with a 2-foot-long crowbar with everyone looking at me, extremely skeptical. I went over to one corner, pried off one nail. That started the whole thing, domino effect. The whole thing ripped off the building, fell down, and just tipped over on the ground, landed flat. Dust shot everywhere, and everybody started clapping. The cool thing is they were so happy that I did it so easily and no one got hurt that they ended up taking the entire thing apart, and I drove away with that wood as well, and that shelf is part of that wood. I've also made a lot of other tabletops with it as well. For distressing the furniture that I make, I keep it pretty simple. I just use an Orbital Sander once the paint is good and dry, and I use 220 grit sandpaper. After that distressing is done, I come back in and I peg all of my joints. So I drill all my holes after the fact. You could also do it ahead of time, but a lot of times the paint will kind of glob up in all the holes. I use a brad point drill bit, and that cuts a nice clean hole. For those rails, those longer rails through those end rails, I'm doweling them with about a 2.5 inch long oak dowels. You could also use screws in their place and just countersink the head and fill that in somehow. For my tenons, I use oak dowels as well. I'm using 1/4 inch dowels in these smaller tenons, and then up top here I use 3/8 inch dowels. And I don't measure where I'm drilling all these holes. I do all this by eye. I've done a lot of them. And in general, you know, this style of furniture, you can kind of get away with different little inconsistencies and not have everything be flawless. It doesn't matter. You know, in the end, the piece is supposed to look like something that was just simply made at a farm in some man's workshop. You don't need it to be highly polished and perfect. It kind of is perfect in the way that it's not perfect. Using a biscuit joiner, I cut little slots around the inside of the aprons and the rails. These are used for attaching the tabletop later using tabletop fasteners that I buy through McFeely's. At this point, the base is done and I need to apply a clear coat to my finish, and that really brings out the distressing. I use Minwax polyacrylic and I cut it about 50% water and only brush on one coat, and that gives it a sheen that I like. With the finish on the base drying, I can start making the top. And for the top, I'm using ceiling joists that came out of the kitchen in my renovation of my own house. It had sort of just uneven spacing, and I was already ripping a wall out and putting a beam in, so I went ahead and ripped those ceiling joists out and ended up using them later. They were stored in my basement, some outside. They were wet. They were pressure washed and all that. So I cut them to rough length and stored them in my attic during the summer, which completely dried them out and got them ready to be used in this project. If you choose to use some reclaimed wood in your projects, you want to be careful that there's no metal in the wood. You can run them into your blades, your planer blades, whatever, and it's just going to mess things up. Technically, it can be a little dangerous. Most of the time, it's just going to dull your blades down, so I use a little small metal detector just to check things ahead of time. Sometimes I'll run them through the planer first because I know the nails are only in the edge, but right here, for example, when I straighten that edge out with my track saw, I want to make sure that I'm not going to run that expensive blade into just some big thick nail. When you're new to woodworking, a lot of the terms that you're going to hear in videos and read in books are going to be pretty unfamiliar to you, but normally you can figure it out. And one of those terms that some people don't know what it really means is the jointing process. Jointing is usually going to create a flat face and a flat and square edge to a board, and then you would run the board through the planer and then rip it, and then you've got a perfectly square board. Well, that requires planers and jointers. A planer is pretty easy. You can buy a planer from Lowe's for a couple $100, but to get a joiner that works well and is sort of worth the space that it takes up, you kind of have to step up in price or find a nice used one. What I find works well for making my tables and islands is using a Festool track saw in its place. You can also use a hand plane to get things jointed out as well if you're looking for a challenge. One issue that you're going to run into, and really any woodworker, even advanced woodworkers run into, when you're gluing together tabletops and slabs, a lot of times the boards will slip on the glue, and it just makes for a more uneven top. You have to then work the top down. That removes thickness and adds extra time to the project. One simple solution to that is using a plate joiner or biscuit joiner and just add biscuits in, and not so much for strength but more for alignment. You can also use a Festool domino tool to do the same thing. Gluing up the top doesn't really need a whole lot of explanation. It's pretty self-explanatory as far as the video goes. The one thing I will kind of warn you about is that when you are clamping the top up, that you want to have even pressure top and bottom. So you can see I have the row of clamps that the slab is sitting on, but then I'm going to come back in and apply some clamps to the top. This makes sure that you're not sort of gluing a cup into the tabletop itself. If you just do them on the underside, you'll notice if you kind of sight down the across the boards, that'll be kind of bowed upwards, just because of once the pressure is applied to the clamps, they kind of want to flare out a little bit. One debate in woodworking is whether or not to wipe off the glue or kind of scrape it off afterwards. I've always been a fan of wiping it off ahead of time. There's other issues that come in when you scrape the glue off, and usually it results in damaging your surface. So I'm a wiper, not a scraper. And and then one thing you'll notice there at the end, I trim my ends of my tabletops square after the glue up. Some people will try to cut everything perfectly to length and get it all lined up, but you're usually going to end up with some sort of shifting. So that's one thing that having a track saw really works good for, is getting a perfectly flush ends on your tables. Reclaimed lumber does add kind of an interesting look to your pieces of furniture, but it's going to come with challenges that may not exist with new lumber. One of them being knot holes, nail holes, just damaged areas from demolition and such. And one solution to that is just using wood filler and filling things in, or just leaving the damaged areas. Well, wood filler, it does not look like wood, it just looks like wood filler. It's usually just yellow or white. Leaving the damaged areas in a kitchen setting, for example, can just be a place that kind of stuff collects. In my case of my personal dining room table, usually it's always salt and peppers, always down in some of the knot holes. So for customers, I like to mix up some West System epoxy and fill those voids. It comes out clear, or either you can tint it darker. It looks much better, it's slick, and it kind of still leaves that area, it still features that knot or hole or whatever it is without just filling it with wood filler. So it's functional and it looks good. I get things sanded up with 220, up to 220 grit sandpaper, and then brush on my first coat of finish. And the first coat of finish, you don't need to be careful, it's going to soak in. Just get it on there, you're going to sand it down anyway. So for a couple quick tips on the finishing process, first of all, you're going to want to finish all sides of your tabletops, island tops, whatever it is you're doing. Just make sure that the moisture content stays the same on both sides and the top itself doesn't cup later on, meaning it formed kind of a rounded up, towards the ceiling, or the ends kind of coming up to where the center is getting kind of bowled out. So it's important to put coats on both sides. As far as the finish itself, I just slap it on, sand in between the coats with 220 grit sandpaper, and go for 3 or 4 coats on projects like this. And that again is using Minwax polyacrylic or finishes like polyurethane. Same pretty much applies for lacquer as well. When it comes to using polyacrylic and other water-based finishes, I usually like to give it 24 hours afterwards before I do any kind of heavy handling, just to make sure that I'm not getting fingerprints in the finish or anything. But I've even brushed on finish in the back of my truck as I drive it to a customer's house, in cases where it was a really big rush and everything worked out fine. But this customer, she was really happy. This is the 3rd or 4th piece of furniture that she's bought from me, and selling this piece of furniture to her paid for all the materials to drywall my house. So that was a pretty cool aspect of the project. Well, that pretty much wraps everything up for this video. I hope you all enjoyed seeing the project get built. I certainly had a nice time making it here in the shop. If you have any questions at all, be sure to send me those in an email or by leaving a comment below the video. And for all the different things that I mentioned in the first part of the video, during the project, and now all those links are in the description, such as where to get these t-shirts, where to get the plans, and also how to get to my website, which is thehomesteadcraftsman.com. So I have all the links in the description, but you can get to all these things from my website as well. The plans themselves are plans that I draw them all out in pen and ink, scan them into the computer, and then add all the dimensions and the text needed to build the project. So if you are interested, go ahead and check those out. You can take a look at sort of what they sort of look like on the website before you even buy them. And it's a digital download, so you pay online and then you download the plans after that, and then you can print them out. And the great thing about that is you can write on them, you can mess them up. If you tear your sheet of paper in half, you can just print another one out. So it's really easy, and if you would like to build these islands and then sell them, go ahead and do so. I guess that pretty much wraps everything up. Like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you in future videos. If you're not already a subscriber, subscribe to the channel and you'll get updates when I post future videos. All right, thanks for watching.